There's a thing nobody tells you about men who stand still for a living. People walk past them all day. Tourists lean in close, make faces, wave their hands an inch from their eyes, try to make them laugh. And the guard just stands there, stone. You start to think there's nobody home behind that face. You start to think the uniform is the man. But I'll tell you something. The stillest men I ever met were the ones thinking the hardest, and Daniel Hale was the stillest man on that gate. This is the story of the morning he didn't move when everyone else did, and how that one decision, to not move, to not run, to hold a square of pavement that wasn't even his to defend, ended up changing his whole life. Let me take you back. It was a Tuesday in early autumn, the kind of morning where the air has just turned, where you can smell the season changing if you stand still long enough to notice. There was a low mist over the grounds when the cars first arrived, the sort that burns off by mid-morning but makes everything soft and gray while it lasts. Ravenscourt sat about 40 minutes outside the Capitol, down a long road lined with old oaks. It was a school, but it didn't look like a school. It looked like somewhere a story would happen. Gray stone, ivy on the west wall, a clock tower that ran 2 minutes slow and had done for 60 years, and nobody had ever bothered to fix because the boys liked it that way. There was a chapel. There were playing fields that went on further than your eye could follow. And there was a wrought iron gate at the front, tall and black, with the school crest worked into the metal. That gate is where this whole thing happens, so hold it in your mind. Daniel Hale had been a soldier for 9 years. Ceremonial mostly. He was the kind of man who'd spent more hours standing perfectly still than most people spend asleep. He knew how to lock his knees the wrong way so they wouldn't buckle. He knew how to breathe so slow that his chest barely moved. He knew the trick of letting his eyes go soft and far away so the tourists couldn't catch his gaze, while still, and this is the part people never understood, still seeing absolutely everything. That was the secret of it. The stillness wasn't emptiness. The stillness was attention. He was 28 that autumn. Not tall, not the way you'd imagine. Broad, though. Quiet voice when he used it, which wasn't often. He had a younger sister who teased him about the hat. He had a mother who kept a photograph of him in uniform on the mantelpiece and told everyone who came round, whether they asked or not. He had a habit, when he was off duty, of going very still anyway, sitting in a chair by the window, and his sister used to throw cushions at him to check he was still alive. I tell you these small things because you should know he was a person. That matters later. Everyone in this story is a person. Even the one who came to the gate that morning with a wrong thing in his head, he was a person too. That's the part that made it hard. The reason there was anybody important at Ravenscourt that morning was simple. It was a visit, a planned one, months in the diary. King Edmund of the House of Aldrich, a quiet king, more comfortable in a greenhouse than on a balcony, the sort of man the public had grown fond of precisely because he didn't seem to enjoy the fuss, was coming to open a new building. A science block of all things. Glass and steel, very modern, didn't match the rest of the place at all, and that was rather the point. The future bolted onto the past. Somebody in a planning office had probably written that exact phrase in a brochure. And here's the thing that made the morning what it was. The king's grandson went to that school. Prince Thomas, 12 years old, second row from the back in every class photo because he'd shot up that year and the teachers kept moving him. He was, by every account from the people who actually knew him rather than the people who wrote about him, an ordinary boy. He liked football more than he was good at it. He had a best friend called Oliver who could burp the alphabet, a skill Thomas envied openly. He was shy with strangers and loud with his friends, and he hated the fuss that came with who his grandfather was. That was the thing about Thomas. He just wanted to be one of the boys, and mostly at Ravenscourt they let him. The other children had stopped noticing years ago. He was just Thomas. He got told off for talking in chapel like everyone else. He got picked last for the good team and second to last for the bad one. He was, in the only way that mattered to a 12-year-old, normal. But on the days the cars came, he couldn't be normal. On the days the cars came, the whole world remembered who his grandfather was, and so did he. The morning of the visit, the security was heavy but quiet. That's how it's meant to be. You're not supposed to notice it. There were men in plain suits with earpieces walking the ground since dawn. There were dogs. There was a sweep of the new building, every room, every cupboard. There were officers posted along the route the king's car would take, from the main road to the front of the school. And at the front gate, the tall black one with the crest, there was Daniel Hale. Now you have to understand. Hale wasn't there as a bodyguard. That's not what a ceremonial guard is. He was there because the school had asked for the full thing, the proper occasion, and a guard at the gate in dress uniform was part of the picture. He was scenery, in a sense. A symbol. The real protection was the men in the suits and the men you couldn't see at all. Hale knew that. He'd been told that more or less in the briefing. Your post is the front gate. You hold the gate. The principals will pass through. You present arms. You do not leave your post. That last line said twice. You do not leave your post. So that's where he was. 6 in the morning in the mist, on a square of pavement just inside the gate, standing still while the world woke up around him. By 8:30 the mist had thinned, and the crowd had started. Because that's the other thing about a royal visit to a school. The school is private, the grounds are sealed, but the road outside isn't. And word gets round. It always gets round. By 8 there were maybe 40 people gathered on the far side of the gate, out on the public verge by the road. Locals mostly. A few mums with prams. An old man who'd brought a little flag and a folding stool and clearly intended to make a morning of it. Some teenagers filming on their phones. A woman with a dog. The usual crowd that gathers anywhere something might happen. They were happy. That's worth saying. It was a happy crowd. Somebody had brought a flask. There was the smell of coffee on the cool air and cut grass, and somewhere a radio playing low. People chatted to strangers the way they do at these things, all the normal English shyness gone for an hour because they were all there for the same small reason. And on the other side of the iron, 10 feet away, stood Hale, still as the gate itself. The tourists, well, not tourists exactly, but the crowd, they did what crowds always do. They tried to get a reaction. A couple of the teenagers came right up to the bars and pulled faces. The old man with the flag called out something friendly about the weather. A little girl, no more than 4, pressed her face between the railings and stared at him with enormous serious eyes for a full minute, the way only very small children can. And Hale, who was not supposed to move, who was scenery, who was stone, let the corner of his mouth go just barely, just for her. And then put it back. She probably thought she'd imagined it. Her mum lifted her up onto her shoulders, and she waved at him with a fat little hand, and he stood there, and did not wave back. And inside, where nobody could see, he was the warmest he'd been all morning. I want you to hold onto that little girl too. She comes back. Here's how I know all this, by the way, before we go further. I was there. Not on the inside, I was in the crowd, on the public verge, with my own flask and my own reasons. I'd grown up in the village. I knew the school. My nephew went there 2 years below Thomas, and I'd come down because my sister couldn't and somebody from the family ought to wave a flag, she said. So I was standing maybe 15 feet from the gate when it all happened, close enough to see it, far enough that I couldn't do a single thing about it. I've told this story 100 times since, to friends, to family, once to a journalist I shouldn't have talked to. And every time I tell it, I notice I slow down at the same place, right about now. Because at 8:45, the mood changed, and it changed because of one man. I'd noticed him before anything happened. I think a few of us had. The way you notice a wrong note in a song before you can say what's wrong about it. He came up the verge from the direction of the bus stop on his own. 30s maybe. A gray coat too heavy for the morning, done all the way up. He didn't have a flag, he didn't have a flask. He didn't talk to anyone, and that on its own wasn't strange, plenty of people don't, but there was a way he moved that I keep trying to describe and keep failing. He moved like a man following instructions only he could hear. He'd stop. He'd look at the gate. He'd move 3 feet along. He'd stop again. His lips moved sometimes, just a little, like a man having an argument with somebody who wasn't there. The woman with the dog stepped away from him. I saw her do it. She didn't make a thing of it. She just gathered her lead in and drifted off down the verge with her back very straight, and I thought, she's felt it too. And here's the part I think about most. From inside the gate, 50 feet away, behind iron bars, standing dead still and not allowed to turn his head, Daniel Hale had clocked him before any of us. I found that out later. I'll tell you how later, but it's true. The man in the gray coat had been on Hale's radar from the moment he came up off the road, because Hale had spent 9 years learning to watch a crowd without appearing to watch anything at all, and a man who doesn't fit the shape of a crowd lights up like a flare to someone trained to see it. He couldn't leave his post. He'd been told twice, "You do not leave your post." He couldn't shout, not yet, not on a reading he couldn't be sure of, not with 40 happy people and a 4-year-old and an old man with a flag, not on a feeling. A guard who breaks formation and starts shouting at a member of the public who's done nothing but stand badly, that's its own kind of incident. That ends careers too. That frightens children for no reason. So he did the only thing he could do. He watched. And he started very slowly, very quietly, doing the small things a man in his position is allowed to do that nobody in the crowd would ever notice. The cars were due at 9. You could feel it coming the way you feel a train before you hear it. One of the men in suits who'd been drifting near the gate all morning looking like he was thinking about nothing, stopped looking like he was thinking about nothing. He touched his ear. He said something I couldn't hear. Down the long road past the oaks, there was a change in the light sun coming through properly now, the mist all gone and a shape, a first car, a long way off. The crowd felt it too and pressed forward, gently, the way crowds do, everyone wanting to be a foot closer than they'd been a second ago. The old man stood up off his stool. The little girl's mum hoisted her back onto her shoulders. Phones came up. There was a ripple of that particular happy noise a crowd makes when the thing it's been waiting for finally starts to arrive. And in that ripple, in that surge forward of 40 people all leaning toward the gate at once, the man in the gray coat moved differently from everybody else. Everyone else surged and stopped, polite even in their eagerness. He didn't stop, he used the surge. He let the press of the crowd carry him forward, and then he kept going, slipping between people, not shoving, just flowing, the way water finds the gap. And in about 4 seconds he'd gone from the back of the crowd to the front, right up against the iron, right at the join where the two halves of the gate met and where, and this is the part that makes my stomach drop even now, all these years later, where, in about 90 seconds, those gates were going to swing open to let the king's car through. He put his hands on the bars. He looked through them up the drive at the cars coming, and his lips were moving. Nobody else had noticed yet. 40 people, all looking up the road at the king. One man looking through the gate and one man on the far side of the iron, in a tall hat and a red coat, looking straight back at him. I'm going to stop there for part 1, because what happens in the next 90 seconds deserves its own breath. But I'll leave you with this, the thing I didn't understand until much later, the thing that turned out to be the whole heart of it. Daniel Hale had a choice in that moment, and it wasn't the choice you'd think. It wasn't fight or run. A man like that doesn't run, and there was nothing yet to fight. His choice was harder than that. His choice was move or hold. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to break formation, to cross the 10 feet of gravel, to put himself between that gate and that car. Every instinct. And his orders said twice were, "Do not leave your post. I've thought a lot over the years about what a second actually is. You think you know, 60 of them in a minute, a small thing. You can't do much in a second. You can't tie a shoelace in a second. You can't read a sentence. But I've come to believe that some seconds are bigger than others. That some of them open up like a hand, and inside them there's more room than you'd ever think, and a person can do an enormous amount in a space you couldn't even measure on a clock. The 90 seconds I'm about to tell you about. I've slowed them down so many times in my own head that I'm not sure anymore which parts I truly saw and which parts I've built since from things people told me. But this is how it lives in me now. So this is how I'll tell it. The first car came through the trees, and the crowd made its noise. It wasn't the king's car. I learned that later. The first one's never the important one. But the crowd didn't know that and didn't care, and the sound went up, that happy roar, flags going, the old man's voice cracking on a cheer, the little girl on her mum's shoulders bouncing and clapping with both hands. And in all that noise, the man in the gray coat had both hands on the gate. I was close enough now to see his knuckles. They'd gone white. He was gripping the iron like the iron was the only thing holding him to the earth. His lips were going faster. And his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes weren't angry. That's what I keep coming back to. I'd expected anger when I made sense of it after, but there was no anger in him. There was something worse. There was a kind of terrible certainty, the look of a man who's decided something and gone all the way past the place where you could talk him out of it. He started to climb. Not fast, that's the strange thing. He didn't scramble. He put one foot up onto the low crossbar of the gate, calm as you like, the way you'd step onto a curb, and he reached up for the next bar with one white-knuckled hand, and he began, very deliberately, to climb the gate that was about to open for the king. Here's what happened in the crowd, and I'm ashamed of it, and I think most of us would be. Nothing. For a second, one of those big seconds, nobody did anything, because nobody could believe it. That's the truth of how these things go, and anyone who tells you different has never stood in a crowd when the floor falls out of an ordinary morning. We didn't all gasp and surge. We froze. 40 people who'd been cheering a second before just stopped. Every one of us, like somebody had pressed pause, because the thing in front of us didn't fit anything we knew and our brains were still scrambling to catch up. Is that allowed? Is that part of it? Should somebody? The old man with the flag had his arms still half raised in a cheer he hadn't finished. The little girl had stopped clapping. And in that frozen second, the man was halfway up the gate. Now I want to take you to the other side of the iron, because that's where the real story was, and I only learned it in pieces afterward, and I've put the pieces together as best I can. Daniel Hale had been watching the gray coat for the better part of an hour. He'd watched it come up off the road. He'd watched it stop and start. He'd watched the woman with the dog step away. He'd done the maths 100 times in his still and silent head, and every time the maths had come out the same. That one. Watch that one. He'd done what he could without breaking. There's a chain, you see, even when you can't see it. A guard at a gate isn't alone, even when he looks alone. Hale had a man behind him, one of the suits, posted near the gatehouse, and over the long, slow morning, without ever turning his head, without ever appearing to do anything but stand, Hale had been talking to him. A word barely moving his lips, a small shift of his eyes that the suit had been trained to read. Gray coat, coming up the verge. Watch the join in the gate. So they were watching. He'd done it right. He'd flagged it the way you're meant to, quietly up the chain, no drama, no frightened children. But here's the trouble with doing it right. Doing it right is slow. And the man on the gate had just decided to be fast. The suit by the gatehouse moved the instant the gray coat's foot hit the crossbar. He was good, that man. He didn't freeze the way the crowd froze. He came off the wall at a dead run, talking into his cuff, calling it in, and he was maybe 40 feet away, with the gatehouse and a stretch of gravel between him and the gate. 40 feet is a long way when a man is already climbing. And the gates, this is the thing, this is the awful timing of it, the gates were beginning to open. Somewhere a signal had been given for the king's car, which was now coming through the trees behind the first, and the great black halves of the gate had started, slow and stately, to swing inward, which meant the bars the man was climbing were moving, swinging in toward the drive, toward the cars, carrying him with them. Hale was 10 feet away. The suit was 40. The gate was opening, and the gray coat was coming over the top. Every account of what Hale did next agrees on the facts and disagrees on the meaning, and I've decided the meaning is the part that's mine to give you, so here it is. The facts first. Hale did not run to the gate. That's fact one, and it's the one that confused people afterward, the one a couple of armchair types online tried to make ugly, said he hesitated, said he froze like the rest of us. They're wrong, and I'll tell you why they're wrong. He didn't run at the man, he ran to the child. Because, and this is the thing only Hale could have known, from where he stood, with the angle he had that none of us in the crowd had, the gate wasn't the danger. The man wasn't even, in the end, the worst of the danger. The worst of the danger was where everything was about to go. You see, the second car, the king's car, had a small figure in the back beside the older man. The king had brought his grandson up the drive with him, to arrive together, the two of them, a private little kindness on a public day. Prince Thomas was in that car, and the car had slowed almost to a stop, exactly where the drive met the opening gates, because the driver had seen the man climbing and done the right thing, which was to brake. Which meant that the king's car, with the boy in it, was now stationary, 10 feet inside a gate that a stranger was coming over the top of, and the suit was still 30 feet away. Hale saw all of that in one of those big seconds, and he made his choice. He broke his post. I want to sit on that for a moment, because I think it's the whole heart of him. You do not leave your post, said twice, drilled into 9 years of him. A guard who breaks formation is a guard who's failed the one simple thing he was put there to do, and Hale was a man who had never in 9 years failed a simple thing, and the holding of that post was, to a man like him, very close to the holding of his own self. And he gave it up, in a heartbeat, without a flicker of the thing the rest of us were drowning in. He came off his square of pavement at a sprint, and a man in dress uniform, in that hat, in those boots, is not built to sprint, and he did it anyway, and he did not go to the man on the gate, who the suit was already closing on now, who was one problem among two. He ran to the car. He put himself in the gap, between the stranger coming over the iron and the stopped car with the boy in it in the open with nothing in his hands. Daniel Hale planted both feet and stood. He went still again. That's the part that takes my breath. In the middle of the only 90 seconds of chaos in his whole still life, the thing he did was find a place to stand and stand. It happened all at once after that, the way these things do once they break open. The man came over the top of the gate and dropped. He landed badly, went down on one knee on the gravel, and for a second he was just a man kneeling on the ground inside the wrong gate, and the suit hit him a heartbeat later. Not a tackle, nothing dramatic. The suit was too good for dramatic, just a firm and total folding up of him, arms, weight, voice low and steady the whole time. All right, stay down, nobody's hurting you. And the gray coat didn't fight. That's the thing nobody who tells this story for the drama ever wants to say. He didn't fight at all. He went down onto the gravel and something went out of him and he started, of all the things in the world, to cry. To weep, right there on the drive, the certainty all gone out of him at once. Just a frightened and unwell man a very long way from home in his own head, who'd come to that gate carrying something none of us could see, and who, thank God, thank every God there is, had carried nothing in his hands but that. There was no weapon. I have to tell you that plainly because it matters, because it's the truth, and because the truth is better than the story people wanted. There was no bomb, no knife, no gun. There was a man who was very ill and very alone and who had built something terrible inside his own mind and walked it to a school gate. What he meant to do if he'd reached the car, nobody can ever fully know, and I've decided I don't need to know, and neither do you. What matters is who stood between him and a 12-year-old boy before anyone could find out. And the boy. Let me tell you about the boy, because this is where it stops being about danger and starts being about something gentler. Prince Thomas was 12 and he was in the back of that car and he saw all of it. He saw the man come over the gate. He saw, very close, through the window, A soldier in a red coat run out of the stillness and plant himself in the gap and become a wall. I've heard from his grandfather's people much later, when this had all become a thing that got talked about in quiet rooms, that the king reached over in that car and put his arm across the boy and pulled him in, the way any grandfather would, king or not. And that Thomas, who was shy with strangers and loud with friends and just wanted to be one of the boys, looked past his grandfather's arm and out the window at the back of a soldier he'd never met, who was standing very still between him and a frightening thing, and that the boy went quiet in a way that wasn't fear. He told someone later, and this is the line I hold onto, this is the small true thing at the center of all of it, he said. He didn't even look scared. He just stood like it was his job to stand there, like he'd been standing there his whole life waiting for it to matter. 12 years old, waiting for it to matter. That's the whole of Daniel Hale, said by a child in a sentence, better than I've managed in 2 parts. The suit had the man. 2 more suits were there within seconds, out of nowhere, the way they appear. The crowd on the other side of the iron came back to life all at once. The freeze broke and there was noise, shouting, somebody screaming, the little girl crying now on her mum's shoulders, because the grown-ups had all gone strange and a child always knows. The old man had dropped his flag. I'd grabbed the railing without knowing I'd done it, and I had a bar of cold iron in each fist, and I don't remember deciding to. The car didn't stop long. They're trained for that too. Once it's contained, you move the principle. You don't sit and gawp. The driver took it forward, slow and smooth, in through the now fully open gates and up toward the school, away from all of it, and the last thing I saw of that car was a small pale face at the back window looking out. Not at the man on the ground. The boy wasn't looking at the man on the ground. He was looking at the soldier, twisted right round in his seat, looking back through the rear window at Daniel Hale, who had not yet moved, who was still standing in the gap where the car had been, on a stranger's gravel, a long way from the post he was never supposed to leave. And the boy lifted his hand, just a little, pressed flat against the glass. Hale didn't wave back. Of course he didn't. He never did, not at the gate, not at the 4-year-old, not at anyone. But I was watching his face from 15 feet away, and I'll go to my own grave saying I saw it, the same thing he'd done for the little girl earlier, the corner of his mouth, there and gone. Then the car was through the trees and up the drive and the boy was gone, and Daniel Hale was standing alone on the gravel with the whole morning broken open around him. And for one moment, before the suits and the questions and the long official aftermath swallowed him up, for one moment he just stood there. Still, the way he knew how to be. I think he was the only calm thing in 100 yards. Now I'd love to tell you the world understood right away what it had seen. It didn't. The world rarely does. What happened first was confusion, and then it was procedure. Hale was taken aside almost at once, gently. But taken aside because a guard who breaks formation has to answer for it, and that's right, that's how it should be, even when he was right to do it. There were questions. There were a great many questions over a great many hours in rooms I never saw. Why did you leave your post? Who gave you the authority? Walk us through the decision. And Daniel Hale, who used about 40 words on a talkative day, had to sit and account for the most important 90 seconds of his life to men with clipboards who hadn't been there. And here's the thing that nearly broke it, the thing that turns part 3, because for a little while in those rooms, it looked like the discipline of leaving his post might count against him more than the courage of why he left it. There were people, early on, who looked at the facts and not the meaning, who saw only that a ceremonial guard had abandoned a clear and twice-given order, and who weren't at all sure that the man should be praised for it. For a few days, Daniel Hale wasn't a hero. For a few days, Daniel Hale was a problem. There's an old idea that the bravest thing a man ever does, nobody sees. I used to think that was just something people said to make quiet lives feel bigger. I don't think that anymore. Because the bravest thing Daniel Hale did wasn't running out into that gap. Running out into the gap was instinct, trained into him over 9 years, the body doing what the body knew. No, the bravest thing he did came after. In a small room with a long table, with no crowd and no boy and no cameras, when men who hadn't been there asked him to explain himself, and he had every reason in the world to dress it up, and didn't. But I'm getting ahead. Let me bring you down off that broken morning the slow way it actually happened. For about 4 days, Daniel Hale's name meant nothing to anyone outside a few quiet rooms, and inside those rooms it meant trouble. I told you at the end of part 2 how it nearly went wrong. Let me tell you properly, because it's the part of the story that the people who only want the cheering tend to skip, and it's the part I find I respect the most. The fact in front of the men with clipboards was simple and it was ugly. A ceremonial guard had received a clear instruction twice, do not leave your post, and had left his post. That a stranger had been on the gate didn't, on its own, change the rule. There were trained men whose whole job was that stranger. The system had a shape, and the shape had worked. The suit had reached the man had gone down, the principles had moved. By the cold reading, Hale's job in all of that had been to stand at the gate and present arms, and instead he'd sprinted across open ground in dress uniform and inserted himself, unarmed, into a live security situation, which is the precise thing a ceremonial guard is told 100 times never, ever to do. And there were people in those rooms, not bad people, I want to be fair, people whose job it is to think about the worst version of every morning, who said, what if he'd been wrong? What if the climbing man had been a drunk, a fool, a sad soul with no harm in him at all, and a soldier had broken formation and charged across the gravel and turned a small embarrassment into a panic, frightened a crowd, frightened a child, made the photographs that go round the world? He got lucky, those people said. We don't promote luck. We don't want 100 guards deciding for themselves which orders to keep. And the thing is, they weren't entirely wrong. That's what made it hard. That's what makes a real story instead of a poster. So they asked him, hour after hour, and this is where I tell you the thing I think is the truest thing about Daniel Hale. They gave him every door out the way these questions do, almost by accident. You assess the man as an active threat. And Hale could have said yes, clean, certain, the answer that made him right. You acted to neutralize a credible danger to the principal. Yes, again, the soldier's answer, the answer with no soft edges. He didn't take the doors. What he said, and I have this from a man who was in the room, years on, over a drink, told quietly like he was still a bit amazed by it. What Hale said was something close to this. I didn't know. I want to be straight with you. I didn't know what he was. I'd watched him an hour and I thought he was wrong and I flagged him and I was right to flag him. But when he came over that gate I didn't have time to know anything. I saw the car had stopped with the boy in it and I saw your man was too far and I saw the gap and I went and stood in it. That's all I did. I stood in the gap. If you're asking did I follow my orders, no, I didn't. I left my post. I'd do it again. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you I knew, because I didn't. And a man could get a medal for that in this room, and it still wouldn't be true. I stood in the gap. The same 4 words the boy used, near enough, without either of them ever hearing the other say it. The man who told me this said the room went quiet after that. Said the clipboard stopped. Said you could have heard the clock. Because what they'd been braced for was a soldier defending himself, and what they got instead was a man telling them, plainly, the one version of events that gave them every reason to come down hard on him, and telling it because it was the true one and he'd rather be punished for the truth than thanked for a lie. You can't drill that into a man. 9 years of standing still doesn't put that in him. He came with that. Some men just do. Now, I told you the king was a quiet sort, more at home in a greenhouse than on a balcony. The kind of man people had grown fond of because he didn't seem to want the fuss. Here is what a quiet king does. When one of his guards stands in a gap for his grandson and then refuses to lie about it. He doesn't make a speech. He doesn't summon the world. He reads the report, all of it, the awkward parts, the what if he'd been wrong parts, the transcript of a guard giving the men with clipboards every reason to break him, and he reads near the end 4 words a soldier said when he could have said grander ones, and he puts the report down. And then I'm told King Edmund did a thing that wasn't in anybody's procedure, and rather annoyed the people whose job is procedure. He asked to see the man. Not in a ballroom, not for the cameras. He asked Daniel Hale to be brought to a small room, the sort of room a king has dozens of and uses none of, and the two of them sat down, the quiet king and the still soldier, with one other person in the corner taking notes, and otherwise the whole thing as private as anything ever gets at that level. I don't know everything that was said. Nobody does, and I think that's right. But I know the shape of it because the shape of it came out, the way these things do, slow and sideways over the years. The king thanked him. Of course he did. But that wasn't the part that mattered, and a man like Edmund knew it wasn't. What mattered was what he said next, which was, more or less, "They've told me you broke your orders. They've told me you'd do it again. They've told me you wouldn't even let them call it certain." A pause here, I'm told. Do you know how rare that is, in a room full of frightened men, to be the one who won't make himself the hero of it? And Hale, who used 40 words on a talkative day, said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say to that, and the king understood the nothing perfectly, being a man of nothings himself. Here is the resolution, the plain facts of it, for those of you who have waited 2 parts to know how it lands. Daniel Hale was not punished. That on its own, given those rooms, was no small thing. But the king went further, and he went further in a way I've come to think was very deliberate and very wise. He didn't reward the breaking of orders. That would have been a terrible message, and Edmund knew it. You can't have 100 guards each deciding which rule to keep. So the recognition, when it came, was framed with great care, and the framing is the whole point. He was promoted. Lance Corporal Hale became Corporal Hale, and it was put about quietly, properly, that the promotion was for sustained vigilance and sound judgment over a long watch, which was true. Because remember, the real thing Hale did right wasn't the sprint. The sprint was the loud part. The thing he did right was the hour before, the watching, the flagging, the quiet word up the chain, the seeing of a wrong man in a happy crowd long before that man's foot touched the gate. That was the soldiering. That was the thing they could honor without honoring the broken order, and it had the great virtue of being the truth. But everyone who needed to know knew what it was really for. The promotion was the official thing. The small room with the quiet king was the real thing. And the realest thing of all came from somebody 12 years old. Some weeks after, once it had all gone quiet, once the suits and the clipboards and the careful wording were all put away, there was a note. It came to Hale through the proper channels, which is to say it had clearly been written by a boy and then handled by about 4 adults before it reached him. And you could tell, because the envelope was very grand and the handwriting inside was very much not. I've never seen it, but the man who told me about the room told me about the note too, and he said Hale carried it, folded in a breast pocket, the way men carry the few small things that turn out to be the whole of their lives. And he said that once, only once, Hale showed it to him, and that it said in a 12-year-old's hand, with one word crossed out and tried again. "Thank you for standing there. My grandfather says you didn't have to, and that's why it counts. I think so too. Thomas." That's it, that's the whole note. Thank you for standing there. Not for being brave. Not for saving anyone. The boy was old enough to know that saving was a big word the grown-ups used and not quite the right one. Thank you for standing there. For the standing. The boy understood, in the way children sometimes understand things straight through to the bone while the adults are still talking around them, that the gift hadn't been the running. The gift had been the staying. A man who'd spent his whole working life learning to stand still, standing still in the one place, and the one moment it would ever truly matter. Like he'd been standing there his whole life waiting for it to matter. I'll tell you the last of it, and then I'll let you go. I went back to that gate a year on. I don't fully know why. My nephew had moved up a year, my sister had her own reasons for not coming, and I drove down on an ordinary morning with no cars expected and no crowd and stood on the public verge by the road with my hands in my pockets. The gate was just a gate. Tall, black, the crest worked into the iron. The clock tower still ran 2 minutes slow. The oaks were turning again. It was that same early autumn time, that same change in the air you can smell if you stand still long enough to notice. And there was a guard on the gate. Not Hale, I asked later carefully, and he'd been moved on and up by then, the way good men are. But a guard, some young one, standing dead still in the cool morning while the world hadn't yet woken up around him, and I stood and watched him for a while the way you do. A woman came past with a little girl. The girl couldn't have been more than 4, and no, before you ask, it wasn't the same one. That one would be 5 by then. This is just how the world rhymes, and the little girl stopped and pressed her face between the railings and stared up at the guard with enormous serious eyes. And the guard stared off into the middle distance the way they're trained to, seeing nothing, seeing everything. And I found I wanted to walk up to that girl's mother and tell her, "You don't know what he is. You think he's scenery. You think the uniform is the man. But I stood on this verge a year ago and I watched one of them come out of the stillness, and I'm telling you, the stillness isn't empty. The stillness is somebody paying attention so hard you'll never see it until the morning it saves you." I didn't, of course. You don't. You just stand there with the cold flask of a thing you can't say, and you let the little girl wave her fat little hand, and you watch a man in a tall hat not wave back, and you understand, finally, what the not waving costs and what it's worth. He stood his post, that's all, that's the whole story. Some men run toward the noise. We make films about those men. But every now and then there's a different kind. The kind who spent his whole life learning to hold still, learning to stay, learning to be the steady thing in the corner of the picture that nobody looks at twice. And the world walks past him for years and thinks there's nobody home. And then one ordinary morning the floor falls out of everything, and 40 people freeze. And the only thing moving in the right direction is the man you'd written off as furniture. He didn't have to stand there. That's why it counts.